When an army gets pushed towards the sea or they're pushed up against a mountain, essentially they're going to fight 10 times harder to win that battle because it's their only alternative. If they don't fight, essentially they're going to be wiped out. So in the case of everyday people and everyday life, you need to change the perspective in your head of, well, it's fine, I'll just do it next week or I'll do it tomorrow. You need to do it now, because if you don't make that conscious decision in your head, you're essentially never going to do it. And in 50 years, you'll still be the same person with the same job, with the same beliefs, with the same attitudes. You have to realize that if you don't change these things about yourself, you'll never achieve the goals that you want to achieve. You'll never become the person that you want to be. And you essentially will never have the life that you want to have.
In today's episode, we're going to dive into personality and emotions, and I guess this modern day hyper-emotionality people have, I guess, to their everyday lives. And then we're going to span on from that and, I guess, discuss some philosophies and Stoicism.
What are emotions and what are the implications of them, essentially?
Yeah. I mean, what are emotions? What's the definition of an emotion?
It's a good question.
Yeah. Is it like a feeling?
Yeah.
That you're overcome with when you're hyper emotional? Like what exactly is that?
Well, I think there's obviously the main ones would be anger, fear,
Yep.
sadness, happiness,
Excitement, all these sort of things.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the other ones span off the main ones. But I do think they can probably be looked at in two ways. You can obviously look at it in terms of the scientific, which is probably the chemical processes in your brain, etc., which obviously come from experiencing certain things in the environment, I suppose. But then you can also look at it in terms of, well, what are the implications of actually experiencing the emotions to the individual person? Because it doesn't really help people just to say, yeah, emotions occur because of X, Y, Z occurring in your brain or the environment. Like, there are implications of what does it mean for your life if you're constantly feeling, say, fear and anxiety? Like, that's going to have actual implications.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's all very true. I guess what I want to do is I want to look at, I guess, the science and the technical aspects of it to start with.
Yeah.
And then we can talk about implications and, I guess, tools for, I guess, managing yourself. And you're talking about the science, like, what is it exactly that makes people so emotional about things? Is it personality traits? Is it genetic? Is it environmental?
I mean, one of the things with personality is that there's a dimension called neuroticism. And essentially that is one of the 5 personality factors in the Big 5 model. And essentially neuroticism is a indication of how much negative emotion you experience. So negative emotion would essentially be, how much anger do I feel? How much fear do I feel? How much depression? How much anxiety? So if you're high in neuroticism, you're high in experiencing those emotions. Whereas if you're low in neuroticism, you don't experience those negative emotions as much. And the interesting thing about that actually is neuroticism and introversion are correlated.
Right.
Whereas low neuroticism and extroverted are actually correlated as well. So that's why there's, I suppose, the classic cliche of the shy, introverted individual that sort of keeps to themselves. There is sort of an explanation of why they might be like that, because essentially they're feeling more anxiety than people that are more social, essentially.
So is neuroticism something that is a genetic trait though? Is it something that's developed over time?
Well, personality is interesting because if I put you in a bunch of different situations, you're going to respond in some way different in each situation. But personality is essentially the factors that are integral to your being that don't change over time.
Right. So irrelevant of situation, they're my traits that I'm going to exhibit no matter where I am.
Essentially. So if you're an extroverted individual, if I put you in a social setting you're probably going to respond in a certain way compared if say you're an introverted person and I put you in a situation that you're comfortable in, say with a bunch of friends you've known for a long time, you're going to be more extroverted in that situation because you feel more comfortable. Whereas if I put you in a situation that's sort of foreign, you're going to probably revert back to your baseline introversion.
Right.
Whereas an extrovert probably will be extroverted in situations they're uncomfortable in as well as comfortable.
Right. So to summarise that, I guess your personality traits are what they are. And in a way, they don't change throughout life. Whereas I guess environments will bring out different things inside of you.
Yeah. So essentially, the way I've heard it described before is, what do you like on a Sunday?
Yeah.
That's what your personality is, essentially, when you got nothing else influencing you.
Like, what do you like when no one's around?
Pretty much.
It's just you driving in a car.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So I suppose, to answer your question, your propensity to experience emotion is probably predetermined through, I suppose, what you've been given in terms of your personality, in some sense.
And you're born with that.
You are.
I guess my view on it is, I think what you're born with, the genetic part, has a big part to play. But I do also believe the environment as you grow up, especially in those early teens, is crucial to, I guess, how you control your emotions moving forward. Is that also an aspect? Is it like a 50-50 split, or is it more the case you're born with certain traits and I guess you're going to succumb to those for the rest of your life?
Well, I mean, the thing is, like, you can put anyone in difficult situations. And over time, everyone has a tolerance of their breaking point, say.
Yeah.
So if I put you in a really stressful situation for a prolonged period of time, you could be a very resilient person and you're not going to break for, say, many years, say.
But at some point.
You're going to break and you're going to be, I suppose, flooded with all of these negative emotions.
Yeah.
And I think that's something where, like, chronic stress and PTSD come into play, but everyone's tolerance to that is different. And I suppose personality definitely plays a part in that sort of equation. I was listening to something the other day, and essentially the cliche is that people that were abused as a child, essentially the reason that they bully is that they've been bullied themselves.
Yeah.
But in reality, that's not true, because if everyone that had been bullied turned into a bully, it means that everyone essentially would end up being a bully.
Yeah. At some point. Just be,
because everyone has experienced bullying in their life, say, and they've gone through negative and traumatic situations. So I think the implication for that is that you sort of either are predetermined to become a certain type of person, or, and I think this relates to today's topic, you become consciously aware of yourself and your personality, and you actually make conscious decisions to go down a certain route.
Yeah.
Whether that be realizing that I was abused when I was younger, but it doesn't mean I need to repeat that cycle of abuse, essentially.
Onto someone else.
100%.
Yeah, it's quite intricate. And I think the reason I want to talk about personality is because that ties into your emotions a lot. And I think your emotions and how you conduct yourself affects every aspect of your life. You know, if I give you a scenario, someone's driving down the road and someone cuts in front of them and they're fuming at this person. All of a sudden, you see those videos online, he gets out the car and he's trying to beat the other guy to death. Yeah. Why is that happening? Why is it such a minuscule event can just set someone off? Is it they're just so fed up with their own life and the straw that's broke the camel back? Or is it they're not in control of themselves at all? That even a tiny thing like that, they're out the car trying to beat the other guy to death.
Well,
it's quite a peculiar thing, right? Because if you look at that from a third point of view, you're like, this guy's a lunatic, right?
Yeah. I mean, I have some thoughts on it, but what is it that would drive someone to do that, do you reckon? Like, what is it? Is it their personality? Is it environment in that case? Like, what would be causing someone to be that hyper-emotional?
Well, I think hyper-emotionality, if you're someone who's hyper-emotional, I think you're not actually in control of yourself and you're just swayed by the events around you. And when you live like that, you actually, to some degree, have no choice how you react to things. You're actually just reactive to the events that happen around you.
Right.
That's a pretty difficult way to live life. And I guess that's kind of the point of this episode and what I want to veer towards, this hyper-emotionality.
Reactivity.
Correct.
Yeah. Rather than control, I suppose.
Exactly. Why is it people have no control over themselves?
Yeah.
And hence their emotions. So why do you think people are acting like these? And I'm just using the case of someone driving down the road, but it could be anything.
I mean, there could be many factors playing in that sort of situation. I suppose when I was doing some research for this, and it's something we have sort of discussed before, but everyone needs a certain period of time spent actually thinking about their own thoughts, and I suppose understanding where they're currently situated and what they're currently experiencing, I suppose. And the way I see it is, I liken it to a computer that processes data. If the computer's not functioning properly, all that data is going to accumulate. And essentially the computer's just not going to be able to run properly anymore. It's the same with your thoughts. You backlog thoughts when you don't process them. And in the case of someone getting out of their car and attempting to bash someone up because of a bit of road rage, you could liken it to that process in that they haven't actually thought about where they are and what thoughts they're currently having. And essentially they've gotten to the point where they're so overwhelmed by these thoughts that essentially they've repressed, that they've exploded out in this explosive behavior or these explosive thoughts or, it's interesting because a lot of people actually will act out some behavior and then think back and think, where the hell did that come from?
Like, why was I acting like that? Yeah.
And this theory, I suppose, of not dealing with your thoughts as they come up is sort of, relating to this situation.
So it's not, what you're saying, it's not necessarily like an accumulation of events in that person's life. It's an accumulation of thoughts that have just built up and then an event happens and it's the straw that breaks the camel's back.
Well, it's right because honestly, we all experience hardship.
Of course.
And we all go through challenging times and situations. So knowing that, I do think it is actually just how you choose to respond to it.
Yeah.
Like, do you deal with things properly when they come up? Like, do you process the negative news? Do you think about what it actually means for the rest of your life? Or do you just repress it and just go on about your day and don't even worry about it until you're forced to worry about it? And I think that's sort of where we're going to go today is, well, it's all well and good to know that I need to process my thoughts, but what would be the tools
to actually use? In
a sense.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we tend to add weight and emotions to events that are kind of irrelevant. And when you look back after, you just kind of look at the way you behaved and you kind of know you're out of control. Why is that? I guess was my question, and you kind of answered that before. But I would also say you got to use these mini tragedies in your life to prepare for real tragedies. Because if you can't control yourself through your boss yelling at you, a car coming in front of you in the lane, how are you going to control yourself when a real tragedy happens? So these are like mini stressful events that are almost testing you in life to prepare for the real ones. And I think that's the kind of way you got to look at when you talk about controlling your emotions. When you talk about tools, what are tools people can implement?
That's a good question. I think we should introduce today's episode essentially of what we're going to talk about, which is Stoicism. And I think we were sort of, I suppose, cautious about how we were going to actually talk about it today because it has been sort of brought into the attention of the mainstream in a way that I think actually doesn't probably depict how helpful Stoicism can actually be. I think there are probably some deeper truths that we can probably discuss today outside of just, I suppose, being tough and not having emotions, etc., which is sort of conveyed by, I suppose, influencers on YouTube and stuff these days when it's not necessarily the reality.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of things online about it are probably actually the inverse of what it really is, like not having emotions, just being cold. But when you look at Stoicism and I guess the philosophy behind it, it's not actually that at all. It's probably about actually accepting your emotions and learning to control them as opposed to saying I don't have emotions at all. And as you said, this is quite a important tie to what we just talked about because When you look at revered leaders in the history of humankind, they all tend to be Stoics. So why is that?
Yeah. I mean, I want to read a little bit of something that I suppose was taken by someone that has done quite a bit of research into Stoicism. And essentially it said that as humans, we're actually rational animals. And that means that we see things in a rational manner. And the perspective of the Stoics was that emotions were essentially just a error in reasoning. So if I look at a situation and I perceive it to be a negative situation, essentially my negative emotions that follow that are just me not actually looking at the situation properly.
So you're misjudging the situation almost.
In a sense.
Right.
Whereas the Stoics would say there's nothing that can actually happen that should lead you down a path of violent emotion, essentially. And I suppose saying that is a focus more on the internal rather than the external.
Yeah, 100%. I think what Stoicism stipulates is you should be concerned with nothing external, and your own true goal in life should be your own moral virtue. What does that actually mean?
Well, what do you mean by moral virtue?
Yeah, what is being virtuous? And I think that's, I guess, that obligation to the people around you and I guess the human condition as a whole. Your only goal should be serving yourself to serve mankind.
I mean, that is definitely a virtuous life. I think you could define as one that's completely natural.
Natural and I think beneficial to your community.
Yeah.
Or the people around you.
I mean, there is a point about society is built off mutual reciprocity. So it is that I'm going to help you, and I know that in the future you're going to help me, and we're going to trust each other that I'm not going to do something underhanded and violate that social contract, and you're not going to do the same to me. And that our societies actually wouldn't operate as smoothly as they have if that wasn't sort of a base level
of understanding or so.
Understanding between the two parties. And I think Stoicism, it paints this very sort of, it's almost black and white way of looking at things. Like you're not trying to extend yourself further than what you really are or what you are capable of. It's sort of developing what's intrinsic to you. And I think anything in terms of deception or underhanded behavior is actually ultimately extending yourself outside of your potential and who you really are. So I suppose in talking about virtues, I mean, why is being virtuous even important?
I think how can you run a society without people who have a sense of moral obligation to themselves and the people around them?
Right.
You can't, right?
No.
If everyone didn't have a sense of moral virtue in their life, it'd be chaos, wouldn't it? Do you think we live in a world where people are more virtuous than they were thousands of years ago? If not, why is it thousands of years ago people used to kill, murder and, just about fight over anything?
Well, I think we have become essentially much more organised than we probably used to be, and technology has allowed communication to occur on a level essentially that was foreign 100,000 years ago.
Yeah.
So essentially, nothing can happen that isn't documented. Like if you deceive someone, you're going to be found out at some point or another, and technology has probably spurred on that progression. And you're going to get essentially what's
coming.
What's coming.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to put it that way, but it is true. And that, on the other hand, it has allowed communities and stuff to build and build and build to a point where, well, essentially the society is so functional that you don't actually have to be as capable probably as you used to be 50 or 100 years ago. Like, you can probably just go through life on autopilot and still, I suppose, make enough money that you can buy food every night, You can probably get a mortgage, etc. You can get a house, but you don't actually have that necessity of, if I don't go out and start developing myself to be useful, well, essentially the ramifications for myself and my future family could be quite dire.
But the ramifications for society are probably zero.
Yeah,
Whereas thousands of years ago, that wasn't the case.
I agree.
Everyone's actions and moral virtues had far more weight back then than they do today.
Like you can probably, I don't know, go your whole life without actually thinking about certain moral questions. And I think that's actually, it's not detrimental for society, but I think eventually it will become that. But for now, I think it's more detrimental to the individual.
Yeah, to yourself.
To yourself. Like it seems to me, and I want to hear your thoughts on this, but people are walking around quite lost in my opinion.
Aimless.
They're acting in ways and they're behaving in ways, but I don't think fully understanding perhaps why they are. Like what's the root reasoning that I have to go out and get a job? What's the reasoning I have to develop myself to my potential? Like if society's so functional, why do I have to develop myself more than I am right now? And I suppose that's a question I'm asking you.
I think it is because society is so functional. You can actually just afford to fit in and not have to, I guess, serve yourself to your fullest potential. As you said previously in the episode, people don't have any time in their day or life to actually look at themselves and reflect on their thoughts or their life. And as a result, you can actually just afford to live by without thinking too much.
Yeah.
And while that may seem easy or comfortable, it's not necessarily a good thing.
Well, what does it do to the individual?
I think there is no individual at that point.
Yeah.
And we're all just, floating by and doing what's told to us. And I don't want to sit here and get too right-winged or anything like that. But when you look at the way the world is today, I would say a lot of people are affected by this hyper-emotionality. And thousands of years ago, that wasn't the case.
Yeah.
I'm not making the point that, the world was a better place thousands of years ago, because probably it wasn't. But I am making the case that if you're too emotional about things, that's not a good thing. Like, you are just waiting for something to happen around you and you're going to implode. So the point and the thing I want to really aim to, I guess, cover today is how can we give some tools to people so any event that happens in their life won't just set them off.
That's a good point. And I want to, I suppose, say that on the context of explaining why people are engaging in behaviors, Stoicism is actually a tool, and it goes for many philosophies, but Stoicism in particular, it's actually a tool that is used to give you that back end of why you're engaging in the behavior. It gives you the actual understanding and the thought processes behind why something might be important to do.
Yeah.
So I suppose in saying that, there are probably some things that are natural to humans.
To the human condition as a whole. I really resonate with Stoicism as a tool because I do believe that. And I think what a lot of Stoicism actually is characterised by is kind of like there is actually no good or bad in life. Nothing that happens is good or bad. Events are independent, then we apply our judgment. So if you're a negative person and something happens around you, it's very, very likely that if an event happens, you're going to characterise that as a negative event. But it may not be. It's your judgment on the things that happen. And when you talk about Stoicism being a tool, if you can understand yourself and apply some of these, I guess, philosophies or principles in life, that's going to serve you moving forward.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I suppose to start with the first tool, and we can have a discussion about it, but essentially it's called premeditation of future evils.
Yeah.
So essentially that means that at the start of each day, you're going to sit down for 5-10 minutes and you're going to think about what things could go wrong throughout the day today. What sort of people am I going to encounter?
Yeah.
How are they going to behave? And how ultimately will I react if something negative occurs? And what this sort of does is it takes any shock value out of something might occur because there is a a perspective that all of these negative emotions actually only occur because of that shock factor. So if you remove that, essentially in the context of this theory, you actually eliminate a lot of, I suppose, the heartache and the negative feelings that you might actually feel throughout the day.
So you're taking the emotion away from something that could potentially happen.
In a sense, you're taking the potential for negative emotions to come up because of confronting adverse situations.
Right. So say you have a big meeting that day, and at the start of the day, you've already premeditating, what does it look like if this goes south? If it does go south, you're not actually going to be shocked or nowhere near as emotional as you normally would be.
Correct. And you might even envision the worst possible outcome. So you might envision that they're going to laugh you out of the room, or they're just not going to. They're not going to respond in a positive way. And at that point, anything that occurs that is better than that
is a win,
a massive win.
That's quite interesting, because I think there's a delicate line to draw there where you don't want people to be negative. You don't want people to be waking up and thinking of the worst case. That's not, I guess, what you're saying.
No,
you're just saying you should be prepared for the worst case, so you're not drawn by it and get overly emotional.
Well, look, Stoicism focuses on the internal. And the internal is what you can control at the end of the day. Everything that happens externally is in some sense out of your control. Like, people are going to respond in the way that they're going to respond. You don't have any decision over that. But you do live in a world where you're constantly interacting with people, and you've got a place in society, essentially. So you're never going to remove that factor. This just tells you that you can anticipate it. It's not to say that you sit down and be negative about things occurring. I'd say this is quite the opposite. This is just saying that these things are inevitable, and even factoring in that most people have the tendency to overemphasize negative situations. In reality, no one's probably going to laugh you out of the room. That is such a out of the usual occurrence. But if inside you realize that I'm actually able to cope with that if it does occur, then you will be fine confronting that situation if it does occur.
Right. Yeah, it's very true that we tend to, as humans, overestimate danger and harm.
Yeah.
And in our heads, we paint this picture that, how many times have you ever thought something, and when has that ever happened? Almost never.
Pretty much.
Right. So it is quite interesting.
Yeah.
When we talk about another tool, what is something else?
I mean, I think probably one of the most famous Stoics was obviously Marcus Aurelius.
Yeah.
And he's known for meditations, which is essentially through his life was his private journals of different thoughts and, I suppose, tools he used to get by, because he was obviously the emperor at one point, and that would have posed extreme stress. And I suppose we were talking earlier about extreme situations actually sometimes are the best tool to take away for everyday situations. Because it sort of stipulates, well, what's the most extreme thing that can happen? You're probably going to need the most extreme coping mechanism at that point. So if you can sort of take that lesson and use someone like Marcus Aurelius to actually take away some lessons, you're probably going to get the most probably effective way of looking at things. So essentially this journaling process relates to the next tool, which is the view from above. So essentially seeing life in context to remind yourself of its smallness in the larger scheme of things. So I'll let you continue after this, but essentially, if it doesn't bother you in 50 years, it shouldn't bother you now.
It doesn't bother you in 500 years. It shouldn't bother you now, I mean, it goes back to what we talked about previously, like these small mini tragedies. When you look back in any span of time, almost always they're relevant. And Marcus Aurelius is, I guess, probably one of the greatest Stoics that people are constantly referring to, and to look at his life and take away lessons, I think is valuable to everyone. And with the emotions, I think if you read the book Meditations, early on, it's actually apparent that Marcus was very emotional as a kid, and he had lost, his father had died very early on, and he was very emotional about things that happened around him.
Right.
And despite contrary belief, Stoicism isn't about saying I don't have emotions. And what you see in the book later on, it's about just controlling them and accepting you are, in some sense, the way that you are. How can I conduct myself internally to live the best possible life?
Yeah.
When you look at Marcus as a whole, what is it about him that took him from a kid with no family to the Emperor of Rome?
Well, that's circumstance in a sense.
Yeah.
Like, it was his birthright to obviously eventually move into that position. But I think what's more interesting is how he dealt with it. Like you said, he was an emotional kid. So why was it that he was actually capable of being essentially one of the greatest emperors of all time? And that's a question. Like, what? Like, it, because obviously at the start of the episode, I said that it's essentially how you judge the situation. Your emotions are you just misjudging it. Like, what are some situations that actually might occur?
Well, I answer that with a question. Do you think if he didn't have these stoic virtues in his life, he would have been one of the greatest emperors of all time?
My suspicion is no.
Yeah, my suspicion is no.
Because he probably would have crumbled or gone down the route of hedonism or many of the other things that eventually probably led to the crumbling of that society, to be honest with you.
It's funny you say that because his brother, I think it's Lucas.
Right.
Yeah, he was actually, he went down that path of hedonism and Marcus, in a lot of his letters, kind of talks about trying to point him to the right direction but never being able to get through to him, which is quite interesting because we've talked about trying to change people a lot and not being able to get through to them. But I think it's apparent that if he wasn't, I guess, practicing these philosophies, he wouldn't have been maybe even an emperor for such a long time.
But think about it in terms of, he was the most powerful person on the planet at that point in time. He could have done anything.
Yeah.
Slaves, like wives, etc. Yeah. He had everything at his disposal. So why did he choose to essentially go down the harder path?
Well, he gets back to, I guess, the Stoic philosophies. Like, you got to have that discipline and that moral virtue to the people around you.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's anyone that's displayed that better than him.
And I suppose that's the point about the extreme case being relevant to the modern audience. I think what I take away from that is there is actual value in living a life that is not characterized by your every whim.
Yeah.
What you want in this moment. There's actual value in a long-term view and thinking outside of, I suppose, your most base desires in some sense.
There's value in the rejection of pleasure. And that's also part of what we're talking about here.
And I suppose the view from above tool that we're talking about allows you to, I suppose, slow down and perhaps withdraw from the moment and the situation. And it allows you to go, essentially, what occurred, is it matter in the grander scheme of things? Like, does this argument I've just had with a friend really matter?
Yeah.
Does this situation with my boss getting annoyed at me over this project really matter?
Yeah.
How am I going to think and feel in 50 years? And this isn't to say that you shouldn't be concerned with, I suppose, reconciling relationships with friends or performing well at work. This is more just to say you don't have to feel these really negative emotions, because ultimately it's not going to kill you, these things.
In some sense or another, these things, when it's all said and done, mean pretty well nothing. And I think, if you were to assess your own life and look at the things that you've reacted to, the things that have happened to you in a third point of view, how many times would you look at yourself and say, why did I do that? A multitude of times.
Yeah.
So I think if that's an interesting tool, because you take the emotion out of yourself.
Yeah.
You're just looking at yourself as an independent party.
Yeah.
And assessing it.
And it's interesting because he did it in a journaling way that it was private, and he wasn't essentially having conversations with people. These are his own thoughts. So you can sort of trust that a bit more. And it's also that One of the key functions of, I suppose, being able to process your thoughts properly is having them externalized in some manner. And when you do that, when you have a conversation with a trusted friend, or say you even go to psychotherapy, or you journal, you're actually organizing your thoughts.
Yeah.
Because you're constantly having thoughts. Like, there's some number of average thoughts, I think it's like 20,000, 50,000 thoughts or something. Yeah. And in that sort of whirlwind, how do you know what you're truly thinking unless you actually put some conscious effort into, I suppose, organizing them into a coherent manner? And I think even the act of what Marcus did of journaling his thoughts actually gave him direction. And from that direction, he could actually move forward in probably a more positive way.
Right. I think because it is personal letters, it's much more meaningful, I guess, for us, because you get a deep depiction into what he was really like.
Yeah.
It's not some author writing things about him. It's, this is what he said and this is what he wrote.
That's right.
And even, to this day, there's lessons to be learned of that.
Yeah. And going back to your point about the guy getting out of his car and almost getting in a fight over some road rage.
Yeah.
It's the same point we're making. If you haven't organized your thoughts, if you haven't dealt with all the negative things that have happened, you're just a bomb that's going to explode.
Yeah, you're a ticking time bomb.
Yeah.
And you're just waiting for as I said previously, you're waiting for anything to happen around you, and how you react to that, to a degree, you have no control over.
Yeah.
And I think it's naive to think that these Stoic principles don't apply to you and can't help people in life, because it's hard to say that you're not going to be susceptible to emotions at some point in your life. You're probably not human if you think that. So to have tools in place, or I guess ideas about these philosophies before you encounter those situations, I think is valuable.
It's an interesting question, because when people's behaviors become ingrained over time, and they definitely do, one of the hard parts is actually breaking out of that routine of day-to-day behaviors and actions, because you're essentially on autopilot. So there's an author named Robert Greene who essentially wrote The 48 Laws of Power, which is another good book, and I think we'll cover it on another episode. But essentially in this book, he stipulates something called death ground. And he took it from a famous military commander, Sun Tzu. And essentially, this tool stipulates that when your back's up against the wall and you have to do something, you're so much more likely to do it. And in the case of this book, he talked about when an army gets pushed towards the sea, or they're pushed up against a mountain, essentially they're going to fight 10 times harder to win that battle, because it's their only alternative. If they don't fight, essentially they're going to be wiped out. So in the case of everyday people and everyday life, you need to change the perspective in your head of, well, it's fine, I'll just do it next week, or I'll do it tomorrow. You need to do it now, because if you don't make that conscious decision in your head, you're essentially never going to do it. And in 50 years, you'll still be the same person with the same job, with the same beliefs, with the same attitudes. You have to realize that if you don't change these things about yourself, you'll never achieve the goals that you want to achieve. You'll never become the person that you want to be. And you essentially will never have the life that you want to have. So this death ground tool essentially gives you a way to overcome this challenge.
Right, so what you're essentially saying is you got to put yourself in an environment where you got no option but to change. You got to have a deadline that's met with the consequence.
Yeah. And that can be a physical environment, but also a mental environment. Yeah. Like the example of changing your perspectives, that if you don't change, well, your outcomes are not going to change. Yeah. It could be the physical example of if you don't perform at work, or you don't do the project, well, your bosses are going to look at you in a negative way. Like, you got to put these deadlines in place so that there is consequences if you don't change, essentially.
Yeah, right. I guess that's a good way to wrap up the tools. I mean, to wrap up the episode, I think there's a lot of misrepresentation online about a lot of things we've talked about, in particular with Stoicism. What we're getting to, and I think what we're trying to highlight, is emotions exist, And that is a good thing. But I guess this hyper emotionality is probably more of a detriment than anything. And I think there's benefit to be gained in being able to control yourself and your emotions.
Yeah.